We're at Luke chapter 2, verse 34 and 35. Try to picture this young couple. They just had this extraordinary baby. They've seen angels. There's been all this excitement, and now they're in the temple, lots of busyness, the heart of Israel's religion. And out of the crowd steps the old man Simeon, who takes the baby and begins to pronounce a blessing. Now, Israel had a long history with prophets giving blessings and also reminding people of what God was going to do in their world. And so as Simeon takes that little child in his arms and he begins to predict what the future is going to be, he's going to be like this straight edge for Israel. He's going to call people to attention. He's going to bring down kings and leaders in the nation. It's pretty disturbing news as well as being a blessing. But what must have really shaken them was the way that he stabs. He says that you're going to have a stab in the heart, Mary. This child is going to bring great pain to you. No young mother wants to hear that about her newborn baby. And you've got to give credit to Simeon. It takes courage to sort of speak a truth like that, a kindness even, preparing Mary for an awful shock at the end of her life. Talking about dangerous events. And so when we begin to step out to follow God, there's going to be danger, there's going to be difficulty. And he predicts this boy is going to bring the kingdom of God with full force. He's going to rip the facade off fake kingdoms. He's going to be uncompromising. His signature is going to be standing for truth, a straight edge that's going to call people to attention. And he saw that this collision was going to bring a lot of pain as well. But think for the moment what's actually happening here. They brought this little baby to be circumcised, and this was part of Israel's history, not just a sort of an odd religious sort of symbol, but it's a reminder of a great historic event. This is Exodus. This is God bringing his people, delivering his people out of Egypt. And the big sign was their sons were going to be dedicated to God. Their firstborn son was going to be given to God, just as Pharaoh lost his son. God was going to lose his son. And you think of all that symbolism coming together as Simeon holds that little baby and as they go through the ritual of circumcision, that huge Exodus event that was the greatest Exodus, the greatest move towards freedom in the world's history. It still touches us. People like Martin Luther King drew on it as he led his people forward. It's a powerful event, and this is a powerful moment. This little baby is going to be the signal. He's going to bring all that Exodus event into fruition, not just for Israel, but for the whole world. And it's just a breathtaking moment to think as Mary and Joseph, in a sense, give over their son to God, that God is actually going to do the same with his son. And that gives this moment extraordinary poignancy, I think, as he blesses them. Well, Simeon's not the only one waiting there in the wings. There's another person about to step into the scene, and it's a woman this time. And her name's Anna, and she's an old lady. And what we notice about the way Luke's telling this story is that women have loomed large. In fact, they almost overshadow the men. Elizabeth and Zechariah, Mary and Joseph, and now this woman, Anna, steps forward out of the crowd too. Now, you've got to remember, in Israel, the women were second rate. In fact, right across the ancient Near Eastern world, women were to take a back place. They weren't invited into the centre of things normally. And so she probably came from a thoroughly Jewish family. She was she's a daughter of Asher, one of the tribes of Israel. And Asher's name meant God has made me glad. Leah, his mum, if you remember the story way back, Leah, his mum, and her rival Rachel are in an argument with their husband Jacob about who's going to produce the heir. Well, Leah had this child by a surrogate mother, and she names him God has made me glad. And when you know that dysfunctional family, to think that God could bring blessing out of it is just amazing. So Anna was part of these watchmen. She was one of the watch keepers, the guardians who tried to keep this story alive in Israel. It wasn't just once upon a time in a galaxy far, far away. This was who they were. This was their identity, and they needed to keep this fresh in their mind. And I like to think that she's a bit different from the people who are running the actual temple, because the glimpses we get of them, they can be given to ritual, they can be given to, fastidious law keeping. But here's a lady, an old lady, who's kind of, somehow it's gripped her heart. And she's channeled the loneliness of widowhood into a practice of prayer and fasting and expectation. And so she's devised this humble life of prayer and prophetic service. And like Simeon, she instantly recognises his little family as they come towards her, and she breaks into ecstatic praise, jumping and dancing and singing, a bit like the shepherds. She's one of the first evangelists. She's telling the good news of what this little boy is going to do. And I like to remind myself too that 3 decades later in this same place, this boy is now a man. He walks in there and with his disciples, and over there in the crowd he sees a widow lady giving just a tiny offering, the most she had, into the offering box. And Jesus sees it like a fast action camera, like a quick shutter. He sees her and he says, "See that lady? She's going to be remembered." So it's beautiful, isn't it, how these small figures, tiny figures, people who seem of no consequence, loom large in God's purposes. They have a part to play. And so Anna plays her little part in the drama and steps off the scene. And so Mary and Joseph, well, what did they do? That's the question. They'd done everything, it says here in verse 39, that they were supposed to do. And the question is, what actually happened? Well, it looks as if, from Luke's account, they went home to Nazareth. But Matthew tells us, no, there was quite a long excursion. In fact, 2 years that they headed away from the danger centre, because Herod, you might remember, was very hostile to the birth of Jesus because he saw him as a threat. So Joseph is warned in a dream, Matthew tells us, and so they head off a long way. This young couple head away from their homeland. They're refugees, and they live for 2 years as refugees in Egypt, and to keep the child safe there until they hear that Herod's died, and then they return. Why didn't Luke tell that story? Well, that's a good question. Sometimes the biographers in those days weren't quite as fussed about getting all the chronology and all the detail in there as we would be. So we just have to leave that question on pause and trust that Matthew got it right and that he's filled in a detail that Luke didn't have. If this is in fact Mary's account, as we think it is, then he chooses to summarise a whole lot of Jesus' life into a very short space. It says here in verse 40, the child grew and became strong, and he was filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was on him. And it really makes you think that here's this 1800 years of history have sort of come to focus, and now Jesus has been trusted to this little peasant family, if you like, living up in the hills of Galilee, with a carpenter shop and a little family in a small village, and that's where he's going to be nurtured. And for 10/11ths of his life, for 30 years, that's pretty much where he lives. And that was the incubator for the brilliant teacher who's going to change the world. And so there in the carpenter shop alongside his dad, perhaps for a while, amongst other working men, Jesus was relaying to him through that microcosm of his family, through his mother and father's instruction, maybe through the local rabbi as well, through the other elders in his little town, and the access they might have had to the scriptures through the synagogue. That was his nurturing, and the voice of God is speaking to him there. And as he travels the beautiful hills around Galilee and looks out on God's creation, it speaks to him. And you can see this in Jesus' teaching. If you feed backwards from where Jesus was at 30, you can see that these things are very front and centre in his thinking. They underpin his teaching. He's learned to observe kids in the marketplace, kids playing, families, mums cooking, men working, farmers farming, men building things. The whole of life is kind of vivid in Jesus' teachings, and he's developed a very sharp eye, and he takes out of those little moments vivid illustrations. And a guy called, I love this book here of T.R. Glover's. It's an old book, but if you can get a hold of it, it's called The Jesus of History. He says so many great things about Jesus, but he says this: the ordinary was sufficient if you see God in it. Jesus saw God in the ordinary things, not just in the big spectacular things, but in the ordinary things. He speaks of, when Jesus speaks of the highest and holiest things, he is simple and as natural as when he's making a table in the carpenter's shop. Sense and sanity are the marks of his religion. And that's what I feel like that incubator, that little town of Nazareth, with all its ordinariness and, probably community arguments and neighbourly disputes and all those kind of things, and doing business every day and the normal domestic routine of life in a small village. That was where the mind and heart of Jesus was being shaped by his Father as he listened to the voice of God in nature, in his family, in the scriptures, in his prayer life. And when you think of this compared to the stupendous events that have gone before with angels filling the sky and so on, it seems so ordinary, doesn't it? Like just a very domestic routine thing. But that's the way it's worked out. And the grace of God was on him. So we need to unpack that. There's a lot to think about. What was happening to Jesus in those 30 years? So fast forward to this moment where the family head off on would have been a holiday, and they travel 100 kilometres and more down the country, probably with a whole lot of people from their friends and neighbours. And it's an exciting time, kids running around and families walking and carrying their stuff and camping out at night. And the expectation at the end of the journey is they're going to arrive in Jerusalem at the temple. And it's Passover, which is the great festival of celebrating when God delivered them some 1,200, 1,300, 1,400 years before from the oppression of Egypt. And here they are right now under the hand of Rome. They've been under the Romans and the Greeks and the Persians and the Babylonians. And the longing for freedom must have been very powerful. And so as they walk towards the city, they begin to sing these songs. You can see them in the middle of the book of Psalms. There's a cluster of Psalms there called the Psalms of Ascents, around the 130 mark. And these songs, as they walked, they sang the songs, and it was lifting their hearts, and the excitement of the promises that God had made to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, to David, that one day Zion would be the city of the great king, and the great king would come. The son of David would come and rule not only Israel but the rest of the world. And the maker of heaven and earth was going to presence himself with them somehow. And if you can picture the excitement as they're going down there, I guess it might have been even like Martin Luther King leading the great marches for freedom back in the day, back in the 1960s in America. But nobody in that throng going up the mountain as they climbed up the hill towards Jerusalem, and the city's there, and the gold dome of the temple's shining there in the sun, and the thrill of seeing it. Nobody could have guessed that this 12-year-old boy walking up there singing with his family was going to be the fulfilment of all those deep longings that had been bottled up and clung on to in Israel for all these centuries. And there, picture Jesus singing these words. I'll just read a few of them. For the sake of your servant David, don't reject your anointed one. The Lord swore an oath to David, a sure oath that he would not revoke. One of your descendants I will place on your throne. Imagine Jesus singing this and perhaps beginning to realise in his heart, that's me. For the Lord has chosen Zion. He has desired it for his dwelling, saying, this is my resting place forever and ever, and here I will sit enthroned, for I have desired it. I will bless her with abundant provisions. Her poor I will satisfy with food. I will clothe her priests with salvation. Her faithful people will ever sing for joy, and there I will make a king grow for David, and set a lamp of my anointed one. I will clothe his enemies with shame, but his head will be adorned with a radiant crown. Pretty heady stuff. And imagine Jesus sensing in his heart of hearts this is me. I'm going to fulfill this. And it seems to me, anyway, by what follows, that that's exactly what's happening. He's begun to realise, as he's read the scriptures, that this is a blueprint for his life, even just as a young boy. And so the festival goes ahead. They celebrate with perhaps tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands perhaps of people coming from all over the world to Jerusalem, Jews from all over the scattered parts of the empire coming there to worship, and with a hope that somehow they were going to be delivered one day. Well, the drama sort of shrinks down to this little domestic moment where they're heading home, perhaps the family are all travelling together, and so his parents don't notice that he's not with all the gang, and until after a couple of days they look around, where in the world, where's Jesus? I don't know, have you seen him? No. And you can imagine the panic. They've been trusted with this little boy. He is the promised one, they think, they know. And now they've lost him. Well, that must have been pretty distressing. And no wonder they rushed back saying, oh no, what have we done? We've failed. And it's a very defining moment. It's the only cameo we get of the 30 years between Jesus' birth and when he starts his ministry. But as the panic sets in and they come back, and you can imagine parents saying, why have you treated us like this? It suggests that he wasn't normally a rebellious boy or naughty or anything like that. There's a sense this is out of character. And I guess for them, must have been very curious as they watched Jesus grow and wondering, who will this boy be? What's he going to be like? And we know that from his adult life, he was a man of exceptional intelligence. He was keenly observant. He was a brilliant communicator. He had a warm and engaging manner. He was friendly and kind to people. So you can imagine all these things were true of him as a boy. And it'd be reasonable to think that, as they found him there, found that he'd actually been sitting for 3 days with all the top professors, if you like, all the top teachers in the nation, and engaged not just in a sort of an academic discourse, sort of swapping notes, but in a deep discussion. He's wrestling with these things that have been bubbling up in his heart out back there in Nazareth as he read the scrolls, as he talked with the elders, as he listened to his parents, as he watched what happened in life. He's beginning to think, I think this blueprint I'm finding here in the Old Testament is really me. And so he begins to test his ideas against his elders. Now, I don't think, and maybe I'm a heretic here, but I don't think Jesus was born with all this sort of, as a baby, was all there. He was God, he knew it all. No, not at all. I think he was growing into it, and he had to learn, just like we do. His intelligence had to grow, his brain had to develop, and language skills and communication skills all came naturally. So he's been piecing all these pieces of the jigsaw together, and now he wants to test his understanding against the best minds and he would hope the best hearts in the nation, men who really loved the law of God. And we've got to be careful we don't write all these men off as, Pharisees. They weren't all like that. There must have been good, scholarly men, honest men there too, who he could test his understanding against. And he'd begun to understand what the poets were saying, what the prophets were saying, and where the history was going. You see, this story of Israel had roots and wings. It was deeply embedded in a story, in history. It wasn't just a fable, it wasn't just mythological, but it really happened, events that had really been happening in sequence. And all along the way, the prophets are correcting the course, calling people back to the original plan of what God wanted Israel to be. And so Jesus is beginning to see, my heart beats with those prophets. I understand why they're angry about Israel's disobedience. I can see where corruption comes in. I can look around this temple and I can see things aren't as they should be. And I watch my neighbours and I watch my friends. And I know things have got to change. I know the world needs help. And so he'd already seen this blueprint for living a joyful existence with his Heavenly Father in the context of his family. And I guess this sort of fired his discussion with those men as they sat around for 3 days in the temple. So when he replies to his parents, "Don't you know I must be about my Father's business?" he's not being rude or dismissive. I think he's showing them that he's on task, he's on course, and that their role is going to fall away eventually. Their job has been to nurture him and to provide this safe zone for him, but things won't remain that way. He belongs to a higher calling. He has a Father in heaven that he's got to obey, and this call of his Father's business. And I've heard somebody say this, and I think it's true, that all business is the Father's business. And so he doesn't say, look, I've got to stay here in the temple, I'm a holy man now, I'm a guru, I've got to sit here with the heavies and become a prodigy, No, he says, okay, I'm coming back home with you. And it says he went home with his mum and dad and he was obedient to them, which tells you a great deal about him, doesn't it? He's not arrogant, he's not precocious, but he's very much a man with his mind made up about where he's going. He knows where the needle is pulling him to true north, and that's where he's headed. He's well and truly focused. He's a man with a mission, and here was his life's work. And so he returns home to Nazareth, to the simplicity of life in the village, knowing that all business was God's business. And it says he grew in wisdom and stature and favour with God and men. Well, we'll leave the story there and we'll come back to it when he meets John the Baptist.